no one has the capacity to deal with that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the reality is that if you try to, you become less and less effective.
This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bears. Right off the bat this week, I want to let you know we're going to be talking about trauma, anger, depression, anxiety, grief, and issues related to mental health. If you choose not to listen to this episode as a result, I fully understand, but please consider looking into mental health resources in your community. Additionally, on this episode, we'll be talking about healthy coping mechanisms, how to ask for help, and why it's vital that we consider self-care as advocates. This week, there will be no news brief edition, as I felt it inappropriate to edit down the interview. Now, on with the show. Liz Sinclair Ruth was a vegetarian at a young age. She went on to become a successful veterinarian, helping to literally save the lives of thousands of animals. Today, she is a counsellor in Guelph, Ontario, and saving more lives than she ever could have imagined. I spent some time with Liz at her office several weeks ago where we discussed important issues for the well-being of advocates, such as managing strong emotions like anger and grief, the importance of taking time for self-care and finding effective tools, and how to ask for help.
Well, why don't we start sort of at the beginning? How did you get to here? We are in Guelph, in a very comfortable room with nice calm tones and plant life and the sound of water, which is relaxing and mutes the noise from other rooms. And you're a counselor. How did you get to here? What was your journey?
Well, I was, before becoming a counselor, I was actually a veterinarian. I actually remember the distinct moment when as a young child, I was about 10 years old, when I decided that I loved animals and realized the complicated roles that animals play in our world. And so from that moment on, I wanted to be a veterinarian because I wanted to help animals. And that's exactly what I did. In high school, I went to university, and then I went and I did my doctor of veterinary medicine.
Was that here in Guelph?
Yeah. So that's what brought me to Guelph. And after that, I was at the Atlantic Veterinary College in PEI for a year after I graduated, decided that I loved Guelph, made my way back here, worked as an emergency veterinarian for about 6 or 7 years. And
was that small animal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
in
mostly
Guelph,
dogs and cats.
You do get a lot of the large animal stuff too in Guelph.
Yeah. There's lots of variety for sure. Because it's like the epicenter for veterinary medicine, in Canada, is one of them at least. And I never, there was a few things that sort of didn't work for me in veterinary medicine. I had a difficult time dealing with compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma of just seeing some of the really difficult things that you see as a veterinarian and some of the conflicts between, what people can afford and what medicine you can do. And I started to realize more and more that a lot of what I did as a veterinarian, especially in emergency medicine, was I did informal counseling of people. You're helping people deal with grief and decision making and family dynamics, trauma. I don't know any veterinarian who hasn't been in a room and you give somebody as animal diagnosis of cancer, and you end up talking then about someone that they know that has cancer or their own cancer and things like that. And I started to realize that a lot of my work was around that. And so I started teaching communications at the University of Guelph to the veterinary students to help them learn how to be better communicators in their future practice. And then ultimately decided to go into counseling and to actually focus on this type of work.
Yeah, it's an interesting leap. And I think what is telling about it is the work that goes into getting into veterinary medicine and getting to where you were at.
Yeah.
I've known a few people who wanted to go that way.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult thing. So it was not a light decision, I imagine.
To go into veterinary medicine.
Well, no, to leave veterinary medicine.
Oh, yeah,
and go into
because
counseling.
I had so much invested in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I started, and to be perfectly honest, sometimes in hindsight, I probably should have sought more of my own counseling because I knew I was dealing with some of these things of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and I sort of stepped away from the practice or from medicine from that. But in addition to that, I never quite found my fit there. So as well, it just, the work didn't quite fit with me. I feel like I was pretty good at it, but it was hard sometimes to see everything that comes through the door.
I can't imagine
Yeah.
dealing with that on a daily basis. And I want to define, before we kind of get into more of this, compassion fatigue, which is a term that I've discussed on the show before, and we've had webinars on, but also vicarious trauma, which I can guess at from context. But if you could offer sort of a loose definition, how would you define what those two terms mean?
So compassion fatigue, you said you've already done some work on that in your previous podcasts. And so that for me is sort of feeling a bit numb to everything. And because you're seeing a lot of, you're feeling overextended in terms of your compassion and empathetic abilities. So I'm an extremely empathetic person. And so I was always the bleeding heart at the, at the clinic, right? When I was the doctor on call there. And then the other side of that, so I found in my practice, sometimes I would either be sort of feeling numb to everything, which would sort of be more the compassion fatigue, or I would be feeling sort of traumatized sometimes by the things that would come in. And so vicarious trauma is what someone experiences when they're not experiencing the trauma themselves, but they can still be traumatized through either witnessing or hearing about other people's or animals' experiences as well. So
I find that something that is definitely worth talking about, because I don't know that it's necessarily, especially those of us in the advocacy, whether we are in the advocacy business, as I would call it, which is what I do, or whether you are someone who is simply empathetic and you're a vegan or you are anti-fur, you do whatever, but you are exposed to a lot of this. And I think with the internet, especially, we can very quickly become exposed to a lot of things.
Absolutely.
Is that something that people need to acknowledge in themselves? Like, this is a real thing that can have negative effects on us.
Absolutely. So I think that recognizing trauma and vicarious trauma in advocacy work, either people who work in the industry or people who just do this on the side or as part of their personal life, or even people that are on any realm of the spectrum there of caring about advocacy work, and that recognizing the trauma that we all take in and process or deal with in different ways, I think is very, very important. And because the impacts of that can be huge. Yeah. And can be very negative, especially if we don't recognize what it is. And so it can come out in all sorts of ways. It can come out as anger. It can come out as depression. It can come out as, having power and control issues and things like that. And so I think that once people make the connection of how our society treats animals sometimes, is once you make that connection, you're susceptible to trauma every day, just going to the grocery store, or just walking down the street, seeing what people are wearing or seeing what people are doing or reading the news. You're susceptible to all sorts of trauma.
And that leads into the interesting concept of triggers, which I feel are sometimes misused in pop culture or in the media. I know in my fantasy football league, it is joked about daily, often several times a day. And it is also something that I personally have experienced. There are certain things for me I see and I can't deal with. There's many things I am very good at compartmentalizing. But for me, there are very specific instances that I cannot watch. I'll watch all of the horrific fur farm footage we get and the trap footage and all of these things, and I can manage that. I've got a couple of very, very, very like super specific things cannot do. And I feel that talking about triggers and or content warnings is another one I've seen, is something I think we as advocates need to have a better handle on. How do you express what a trigger is to people, and maybe what isn't a trigger?
Yeah, so when we talk about trauma, I'm not going too far off of your question here, but when I think of advocates in trauma, I think of two avenues of it. So one, I think that many advocates have experienced trauma themselves, whether that's in their childhood or in their relationship, whether it's racism or sexism or homophobism, any of the isms. And I think for a lot of people that can create a passion for acting out against injustice, and for not tolerating and for speaking out for those that are vulnerable because they themselves have been in powerless feeling situations.
Yeah.
So that's one avenue that trauma can fuel advocates' work. And then the other side of trauma in advocates is what we just talked about once you make those connections of how animals are sometimes viewed by society, then you're open to experiencing more trauma. I think often triggers, a trigger is like a gateway into your brain of of some type of previous trauma or previous experience, then that acts like a floodgate.
Yeah.
That then can literally flood your brain with what is a previous traumatic experience or something like that. Does that resonate with what you're? Yeah.
Yeah. And I find it's interesting that it gets joked about. And I wonder how much of that is simply the fact that a lot of people don't understand it. It's this weird thing that I would think many people on the planet, particularly in the Western world, where we have a lot of good things going for us, it simply won't be experienced. And again, with the part of society I represent, the white male cisgender, blah 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 blah.
Yeah,
it's
all the privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is very seldom, I think, that we are going to be exposed to that in a daily basis.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for a lot of other people, it is a lot more common.
Yeah.
But of course, that is an exercise in empathy for people who don't have empathy, and we're going to go in circles on that until we destroy ourselves. Talking about the different ways that the trauma, whether it's vicarious trauma, whether it's compassion fatigue, or even just the stress, just flat out everyday normal stress, can manifest themselves, I think is very important to discuss as well. I have an anxiety disorder. I probably had it as a young child, but of course didn't get diagnosed until I was 18 and tanked. And it's something I try and be very open about and talk about. And I've done CBT and medication and mindfulness and all of the things that really help. But I find there's still a lot of people who don't understand what anxiety is or don't understand what depression is and the difference between an ongoing depression and maybe, and I'll get the term wrong, but like a depressive state. Is this something that people should be trying to be introspective about? Or is it the kind of thing that they should be speaking to? Like if I'm wondering, am I having these feelings? Should I go to my family doctor? Should I see a counselor such as yourself? Or should I try and, WebMD it, so to speak?
I think there's a lot of things that people can do if they're starting to wonder if they're having these types of feelings, whether it's stress or trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. There's sort of lots of the words that you hear today around mental health, anxiety, depression. These are sort of the biggies in terms of mental health. And there are lots of things that can be done, So having people to talk to. And those are people that are close to you, that are safe people, but also therapists, qualified therapists who can help work through some of these issues, and that's what I do. But I think it's also really important to speak out about these things too, because there's as much as we would like there not to be, there's still a lot of stigma around mental health.
Yeah.
And even though that is changing, change happens slowly. So the more that people speak out about these things, the more that normalizes it for other people who may be experiencing the same thing, that may or may not recognize what they're experiencing. And I know for myself, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I know for myself, I've been some form of vegetarian or vegan since I was 10 years old. I told you there was that moment. I was in a bookstore, and I don't remember the book, but it was this little blue book, and I was opening it, and I remember that very distinct moment as I recognized, that's we eat animals.
Yeah.
That was it for me, right? Or that we have fur, where people wear fur. That's what leather is. That was suddenly I had this like epiphany as a kid. And you can't, once you make that connection, you can't unmake that connection. And of course, at that time, I was a 10-year-old living in rural Alberta.
I'm sure that went over well with the community.
Yeah. And my parents were like, "What the heck are we going to do with you?" And so I know for me, it took me probably about 20 years.
Wow.
To find my voice. And because for me, I always thought, well, I don't want to speak out. I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to live my life the way that I want to live my life. And a lot of the advocacy that I saw at that time was sometimes very traumatizing advocacy, or very angry advocacy of people, yelling at people or judging other people for eating meat or for wearing leather, and that's not really me, and that's not who I wanted to be in the world. But so I only saw those two options of either doing nothing and keeping it really inside me, or of being out there, sort of the PETA-esque, really, kind of really exposing type of advocacy. And then that wasn't enough for me. Keeping it to myself wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And because I felt powerless, and I felt like I wasn't doing enough, and I felt traumatized, by seeing, because you see that you're in the grocery store, you see what people eat, you see people who tease you about being vegetarian or being vegan, right? And so then I slowly started to, as culture changes, and now I live in Guelph, Ontario, which is a pretty progressive place.
Wee bit.
Yeah.
The only place in Ontario to elect a Green Party. Yeah.
Ever. And, so that helped. And also things like society's awareness of animals is is changing, so now being plant-based is much more popular, and it's, and you can go to restaurants and you can get vegan food and vegetarian food, and there's lots of alternatives, and it's much more accessible now than it used to be. And that, to me, I started to see the sort of the positive impetus moving, And I thought, oh, maybe that's something that I could be more involved with, something that is moving people towards a positive way, that's better for the environment, that's better for animals, that's better for health. You know, all of these really positive things about moving forward, as opposed to the sort of scaring people away from, you know, eating meat or wearing fur and things like that. And I think that both of those branches are very important. I always think that sort of those undercover videos, I could never have anything to do with them. I can't watch them. I can't, you know, but they put things on the table.
Yep.
Right? They bring that to attention. They bring legal cases forward, right? They shock people into making it a discussion. This is how I always see it. And then the sort of the softer side of advocacy is the more positive moving forward, provides some solutions to that.
Yep.
To have, okay, this conversation is on the table. What can we do about it? Here's some great, you know, vegan alternatives. Here's some, you know, faux fur. Here's some, you know, leather alternatives and things like that. Let's move forward in a positive way. So that's like the two branches. That's how I conceptualize advocacy work. Yeah. And personally, I'm much more suited to the sort of softer moving forward on the type of branch of it. And so I started volunteering at the Veg Fest in Guelph. You know, so I started to volunteer with that and get a bit more involved in the community. And now I run a Facebook group, the Vegetarian and Vegan Facebook group of Guelph, which has almost 1,200 members now, which I'm really excited about. When I took it over, it had about 400. So that's a lot of change in a year and a half. So I'm really excited about that. And we have meetups and lots of people, and try to be very open and very accessible to people who are just trying to like explore and try some new things. And then also in my work of being, you know, working with people who work in these areas or who are struggling in these areas, of doing advocacy or of just facing sometimes the trauma of how animals are treated in the world. Yeah.
There is a lot going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
Beyond just the animals.
Yeah.
And that is not to minimize the animals. But if you read the news, I'm a news junkie still.
Okay.
I was in the business of news, and I'm still a news junkie. We are on the brink of war regularly now.
Yeah.
Because of someone with Twitter, whose name will not be mentioned.
Yeah.
We're seeing massive changes in social programs here in Ontario overnight. People
and curriculums.
But frontline healthcare workers. My ex was social worker frontline, and you start hearing about cuts. Those are the people who are going to get cuts ultimately, and it is very difficult at times to say, well, it's okay to laugh still. It's okay to have fun. You get all of this horrible stuff going on. And that's something that I have been doing this summer and I'm very proud of myself for accomplishing, is in the face of grief and sadness, allowing myself to still, you know, I go to improv weekly. I spend time with friends every week. I do all of these things and I find a way to enjoy life. Is that something that, well, I'm now just putting words in your mouth, so I'm going to try and rephrase this. How do we get to the point where we can say it is horrible what is happening in the world, and I am observing this, whether it is bearing witness or being a part of trying to provide solutions or uncover things, see these traumas happening, and now I'm going to go watch Family Guy and have a beer and giggle for an hour? How do we present that as okay to people? Because I find that's something that comes up a lot in conversation is, well, no, we've got to focus on this stuff. Yeah, we do. But for me, you know, that's what I do. I find time to do these other things. So tell me why I am better than everybody, I guess is really the question I'm getting at here as I think about it.
You're better than everybody,
Well,
Mike.
thank you. And you've got diplomas on the wall.
Yeah,
So
it's legit. It's legit.
You heard it here first.
So being involved in the kind of work that you're involved in, the kind of work, anyone that has some kind of care in their work, and so in the caring fields, whether that's with human or whether that's with animals or whether it's for paid, profession or whether it's just a hobby on the side. That's quotation marks, just a hobby on the side.
Just took place.
It's very easy to get stuck under the thumb of the grief and the trauma and everything that you're exposed to in the world, even reading the news. I know people that can't read the news because they work in, in a field where they are exposed to a lot of trauma, and then reading the news is just re-traumatizing. Mm-hmm. And so what you're talking about too, being able to go to improv, to sort of try to have a beer if that's your thing, or get together with your gaming friends and things like that. So that's a really important piece of dealing with trauma and compassion fatigue and stress, burnout, all of those things, and that's having boundaries. Mm-hmm. No one has the capacity to deal with that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the reality is that if you try to, you become less and less effective. Sorry, you become more and more affected, and you become less and less effective. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important to take that time to set those boundaries, and boundaries for everyone is different for each person of what that might be. Like you said, you've got some really specific triggers that you cannot be exposed to, but you can watch the videos that your organization does for, exposing, mink farms and things like that just happen in this area, there is no way I can watch those videos. I won't sleep at night. I'll replay them. And so, but maybe what your triggers are, maybe I could handle that.
Yeah.
And so recognizing boundaries and setting boundaries, and then having some type of existence on the other side of that boundary is really important, whether that's, and whatever that is different for all people. It's social time, it's exercise, it's reading, it's watching Family Guy. That's one of the things that we know is really, really important for addressing trauma, PTSD, burnout, stress, all of those things. So that's one of the ways. That's one of the things that people need to do if they're involved in this kind of work.
Yeah, one of the things I was taught by the counselor I've been seeing lately is that it is both normal and healthy to feel more than one thing at once. Mm-hmm. And
isn't that complicated?
it was a very mind-blowing thing, because I remember sitting in the room with her and saying, I feel like I should be more sad right now. Yeah. And her saying, okay, so later you'll be sad. And right now, you can just be relaxed. And I listen to it's a podcast and stand-up comedy. I surround myself with funny whenever possible. Yeah. It is my escape in the world.
I like stand-up comedy too. Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It helps.
It does. Yeah. So, it's like when you listen to that, you're going to laugh and you're going to be happy. And that doesn't mean later you're not sad or that there's sadness under it. But in the moment, you can feel more than one thing. And you're right. It is so complicated to try and wrap your mind around. But for me, it's hearing it told to me in my specific situation. It just clicked. Mm-hmm. And it made everything feel a little bit better. And I think that's also the power of counseling. Yeah. Is having someone say, yes, what you feel is normal. Yeah. And it is remarkable how good that can feel. So I encourage everybody to go to counseling. But I can't remember the point I was going to make now. That happens sometimes.
Just feeling more. You were talking about feeling, more different feelings at the same time, and that's an interesting point too, because that brings up in advocacy work. There's a psychologist, Casey Taft, who works out of Boston, and he actually works with PTSD with veterans mostly, but he also is vegan, and he does some talks on trauma in animal advocacy work. And he made a comment once that has really stuck with me in one of his talks, and it was that, have you ever met the advocate who is angry at everyone and everything, right? Like, I don't care about people. I don't care what you're doing. I only care about animals. I only care about animals. And so anger is the easiest human feeling to feel.
Yeah.
And so, but there's almost always something underneath it, because we know that having anger like that, it's not helping anybody. It's not helping, and most importantly, it's not helping the cause, right?
Yeah.
You're just going to alienate people, right? And offend people. But often what's under that anger is much more complicated feelings.
Yes.
Right? Of hurt, of trauma, of a lot of pain and sadness. I don't know where I was going with that. Beyond that, just recognizing that feelings are very complicated in any context, and especially, I think, when you're talking about advocacy work.
And I wanted to talk about anger.
Yeah.
Because I feel grief is something that we've covered, and grief and trauma have been a very common theme. And I think for most advocates are familiar emotions. And I have found that there's a lot on how to move through grief. The way it's recently been put to me is that grief doesn't go away, but is sort of, we build lives around it. And it becomes a smaller and smaller piece, and it still exists, but we've got all this other stuff. Anger, though, is something I struggle with personally when I get angry, because I am a physically nonviolent person. Even as an angsty teenager hitting a wall, I couldn't really do it.
Yeah.
I tried taking boxing classes. My father was very athletic and aggressive. So I thought, okay, well, I'll be a boxer like he was. And I had a little bit of fun with the warm-ups and stuff. And then I got punched in the face and said, no, I don't like boxing anymore. Because I don't really have, when they say, okay, you need to punch that guy. I said, well, what's my motivation?
Yeah.
What's the backstory here? But also, I don't like getting hit. So it was really a no-go for me.
Yeah.
And I've been doing Couch to 5K and trying to run and taking my dog for lots of walks. But then, at 11 o'clock at night, something happens and you get angry and it's just sitting there. And I'm pretty good at letting go of anger over time. But in the moment, what to do with it. And the danger with that to me in my specific position in advocacy is seeing people then go online angry.
Yeah.
And I am not saying don't be angry. There's a lot of stuff to be angry about.
Yeah, there is.
So by no means am I trying to tone police or anything like that.
It's just how you handle it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's, again, as a social media manager, when I then see they see something traumatic, or there is a reference to something traumatic with wildlife, and they say, we should do that to the human. I have to remove that comment.
Yeah.
Both because it is a dangerous position to be in legally, and also because it then hurts the message we're trying to get across of solutions and finding ways through.
Exactly.
So when we have that very, and I say it's a very quick anger, not the long drawn out one, but a quick, I'm angry. How can we manage that in a more healthy way? How do we funnel that or compartmentalize it to use in a specific area? What is the easy answer to getting rid of anger in all of our lives immediately and achieving world peace?
Magically.
Go. Yes.
And go, yeah.
What is
$1 million
the spell?
question, yeah. I think the distinction you made between what you called slow anger and quick anger is really an important distinction. Because you think of, so the slow anger, if I'm inferring correctly from what you're saying, is sort of the anger at injustice and at inequality, and that fuels our passion and work.
Yes, it's the big, something is wrong with the world.
We need to change this. We need to do something about it. And that can be that anger is, one, very appropriate, two, very motivating, and can be funneled into productive activities.
Yeah.
Advocacy work, or what have you. Lifestyle changes, talking to other people, fueling change. And that's very important. And that can be very purpose-giving even, in our lives for people. And that's because helping others is very purpose-giving in life. The fast anger is almost always destructive.
Yeah.
Like what you're seeing, right? There's usually always feelings underlying it, like we sort of talked about before. And it's looking for a quick discharge. Yes. Right? And so that's often lashing out at those around us, whether that's in the internet, whether that's at a protest, or whether that's, at a family barbecue when someone's eating meat or wearing leather for something like that. And that's almost never productive. It's almost never helpful for anybody. It just hurts everybody, including the person who is doing it.
Yes.
And so the way to deal with that, if you're the one experiencing the anger, I guess the way to deal with it, if you're the moderator, is to do what you're doing, and that you need to do some censorship.
Yeah.
And I have to do that on, say our Facebook, the Vegetarian and Vegan Facebook group sometimes as well. And it's a fine line, right, between, okay, what is appropriate censorship and what is not. And I'm sure that you have those conversations all the time. If you're the one experiencing the anger, the key is to step away and to find ways to calm down. Yeah. And that's going to look differently for every different person, but you physically need to step away from the situation. So step away from the computer in some instances, or step away from the interaction, and find ways to calm down. So, and that's when you're more likely to figure out what those underlying feelings are, and ways to prevent that sort of quick anger is to find productive channels to express your slow anger. Yeah. Because at least in my experience with myself and with other people, is that when you have productive outlets, then you're less likely to be susceptible to maybe those feelings of powerlessness that lead to that quick anger. Whereas when you have an outlet, you're more likely to fuel that quick anger into the slow anger, into doing something more productive. So I encourage anyone and everyone to become involved in some way. And that's going to look different for what it is. For you, it's working in the field. For me, it's running the vegetarian group, the vegan and vegetarian group, and doing counseling for people who do this kind of work. And I sit on a board of advisors for a charitable organization that works to stop animal testing. So
that's the Animals and Science Policy Institute, I believe.
It is. It is
a wonderful organization.
It is. Yeah, they do great work. And and being vegan myself, so. Yeah. But I sometimes had that quick anger. I'm sure we all have. Yep. Right. Before I found those outlets, when I was talking earlier about when I was just trying to keep my passion for animal welfare to myself, for 20 years, no big deal.
Probably no negative consequences to that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's not repressed or anything, I'm sure. But I would have that quick anger sometimes, and I would lash out at people. And I found now that I have outlets, I feel like I'm making a difference in the world. I feel like things are changing. I feel hope towards how animals are treated in the world, and I actively remind myself of those things. And I encourage other people to do the same. I find when people have those things, then they're less likely to get that quick anger that's going to alienate people to our cause, and also even alienate people who are even involved in our cause. And is going to hurt ourselves. So yeah. My problem when I get the quick anger is I'm like a teenage girl. I find the one weakness in someone that they're not confident about and just
poke it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't work out well for anybody.
Yeah. You probably end up damaging relationships.
Oh, yeah.
And hurting yourself and hurting the other person, right? Which I don't know you very well, but I imagine that those aren't your goals in life.
No, I instead
that's not where you want to
cover it
be.
with whiskey.
Yeah, good.
Push it down.
I have sessions available on Monday.
Fun times. To wrap up, the final question is people who are thinking they want help, but aren't really sure how to start. And as someone who's been in and out of every available form of therapy for the last 20 years, I'm very familiar with how to find it.
Yeah.
But we're going to link to your website and everything so people can contact you. But if you live in, Nantucket or rural Alberta, how do you go about finding someone, both a professional, but also someone who can identify and understand the issues? And I think as vegans, maybe it's a little different. Like you might want someone who's maybe more familiar with the issue or will at least be empathetic to it.
Yeah.
What are the steps people should take when they feel I need to talk to someone?
Yeah. So that's the great thing about the internet. These days, there's goods and bads of the internet, but one of the great things is that it can really minimize that distance. So that can help people to find community, even when they're not in a physical community that might share their values. So building community is really important. And then also about talking to a professional, then you can also find somebody who can do so. I do within the province of Ontario. I do Skype and telephone counseling as well for people who may not be in this particular geographical area. And some therapists are starting to identify themselves as, vegan, vegetarian friendly. And, but certainly if you're talking to someone and finding that they're invalidating you or minimizing your experience, like get out of there.
Yeah.
Get out of there, find someone new. Find someone who validates, understands, empathizes with your experiences.
Yeah, I found there's a lot of folks now too who are listing themselves as I don't know what the word is technically, but sort of aware of the social and emotional issues that come along if you are part of the LGBTQ community, or if you are vegan, or if you are any sort of potentially marginalized population, right? Yeah.
And advocates fall into that, and so it's very important to find someone who appreciates that, and not only appreciates it, but focuses on it. Yeah.
But help is available.
Help is definitely available.
I strongly encourage anyone in Ontario who is a compassionate animal lover and in need of someone to talk with to contact Liz, as her expertise and experiences make her an outstanding counselor for advocates. She can be reached at lizsinclairruthcounseling.com. You can find the link on this week's show notes or on the blog at thefurbears.com. Thanks for tuning in this week. Remember, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter at Defender Radio and on Instagram at Howie Michael to get updates on new episodes, contests, and adorable pictures of JJ the Hamilton Hound. Until next time, this is Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.